brought my own cheering section. It's always fun to bring your own cheering section. Well, likewise, that Jean said that it's such a thrill to be part of this whole grouping of people that have all won honors with their books, and it's kind of a humbling experience to know that your book is part of all that too, so it's quite a thrill. And I'm especially pleased that all of my kids came. They're here. Doubletake was actually the first mystery that I ever wrote, and I wrote it with a co-author, Margaret Sutton, and it was published by a small publisher that kind of let it languish, and they did a horrible job. It had a terrible cover, it had terrible editing, and I didn't really find out about the terrible editing until the book had been out for a while, and friends were contacting me saying, "Do you know that there were like mistakes in your book?" I was like, "No, I didn't know that." So then I contacted the publisher and I said, "Yeah, I really think you need to fix that and release a professional book." And he said, "Well, I'll do that if you pay me $100. I don't know. I don't think I'm going to pay you $100 to fix the book that you messed up. So anyway, I got the rights back, but then I lost track of Margaret, and I didn't really feel comfortable redoing the book and re-releasing it myself without her permission. And thank goodness for Facebook, because eventually I found Margaret Sutton on Facebook, and I contacted her and I told her the whole story, and that's why we weren't getting any royalties for the book, because I pulled it. And did she mind if I rewrote it and released it? She said, "No, go for it, Maryann." So last year I rewrote it, had it professionally edited, had a professional cover made. Thank you, Danny Russell, back there, my wonderful cover artist. And then really kind of on a whim, kind of like you said, I just sort of submitted the book for the contest and thought, it's a nice thing to do, and oh well, and then Ellen sent me the email and said, "Your book won." It's like, wow. So that was really pretty cool. This is a police procedural mystery. Features a woman homicide detective. One of the things that I had to learn when I wrote the book with Margaret, my kids were all little. I was a mom with little kids and didn't use language much, and wrote a humor column for the local newspaper. I was known as the Irma Bombeck of Plano, Texas. And we're writing about psychotic killers and cops, and my first pages that I turned into Margaret, she's like, "Maryann, killers don't say gosh, golly gee. Killers say other things." And I said, "Well, what do I need to write, Margaret?" She says, "Well, you need to write, I can't do that. I'm a mom, I can't write those words. What if my kids come in my office and see me typing these bad words?" So she took me out behind her barn and made me say those words until I was comfortable typing them, because you got to be true to the characters, and whether it's your personal choice to use certain language or to talk about certain things or to explore certain avenues of social behavior, that's not you, that's your characters, so we have to kind of make that separation. And I also have worked as a hospital chaplain and was married to a minister. So when I would do talks about some of my other books that also are about cops and killers, and they'd say, "Well, how do you reconcile what those are all about in the language and whatnot?" And I just remind them that it's not me, it's the characters. And I would not be doing justice to the story if I pulled back, because that's my personal moral code. It's not fair to the story or to the characters. So with that said, I'm going to introduce you to Detective Barbara Hopkins, who is a new detective on a little police force in a fictional suburb of Dallas. Determination and persistence usually paid off for Detective Barbara Hopkins, but not this morning. This morning, she was still bogged down in a burglary investigation that should have been routine. It was the 6th day. Damn. She slammed the notebook on her desk and stood up, smoothing the wrinkles on her khaki pants. Across from her, Keith Reeves, engrossed in his own muddy water, looked over. "Going for coffee?" "Yeah." Bring me some. Who says I'm coming back? Keith smiled, an act that turned his craggy face into a tolerant amusement. She recognized it as his way of telling her he knew better. Barbara walked slowly down the hall to the break room, trying to clear her mind for a fresh approach to the case. Since they'd broken that burglary ring a few years back, it hadn't been so easy to tie everything up into a neat little package. Proliferation of drugs into the small town of Twin Lakes brought more chaos to police work that used to be somewhat organized and predictable. Maybe I should shuck it all and make my parents happy. Remembering their shock when she'd first announced her desire to be a cop, Barbara didn't fight the urge to smile. She knew they both had assumed she'd just grow out of it. Even though, while all of her friends were playing with Barbie dolls, she played with toy guns and listened to the police scanner with her Uncle Bob. She'd been about 8 when she first voiced her interest in police work, but her father had registered the same shock years later when she'd walked into his office after making her application to the Twin Lakes department. His response had been no big surprise. You've only been out of college a week. Why not give yourself some time? I don't need any more time. She squared her shoulders and regarded his imposing presence. Besides, it's too late to reconsider. I've already applied. Breaking eye contact, her father had taken a moment to run his pudgy fingers through his mop of white hair. She'd often wondered what thoughts had gone through his mind during the delay. Guess a debate is out of the question, he'd finally said. So what do you want from me? I know I'll be accepted, no problem there, but I'll need your help with Mother. You know what a fit she had last time I even mentioned the possibility. Barbara hadn't thought of that in ages. So much had happened in the last 8 years that it felt like the conversation took place an eternity ago. And she was slightly amused at her early naivety. Why on earth had she thought her mother would be the hardest obstacle to face? Despite changing attitudes and government mandates to include more female police officers, her first years with the force had been the pits. Originally confident that a quick step up the criminal investigations, she'd shouldered one disappointment after another. Chief Broyles had been more inclined to assign her to desk work or routine patrol, neither which offered many investigative opportunities, unless she counted tracking the occasional lost facts. Her big break came 3 years ago when she blustered her way into a juvenile case. The suspect was a 14-year-old boy caught in a B&E, Royce Wertko. She'd never forget that name. Barbara had suspected from the beginning that the case was more than a one-time excursion into criminal activity. Hours spent talking with the gangly teen with a surly attitude reinforced her belief. He had been overly defensive and protective of a couple of 18-year-old dropouts with a long list of priors. The investigation eventually exposed a burglary ring profitably operating out of a pool hall for almost a year. The leader, a 19-year-old dropout with a long-standing drug problem and an attitude, recruited young boys like Wertko to keep him supplied for a percentage of the take. The 18-year-old held the exalted role of business manager. Barbara was enraged that the most vulnerable could be sucked in so easily. Without outside influence, Wertko could probably turn out to be a good kid. So she'd testified at his behalf, and he'd pulled a first offense probated sentence. His 2 friends hadn't been so lucky. They'd gone to prison. She'd expected Royce to be grateful for helping him, but he'd turned on her. You hung my friends out to dry. Now what am I supposed to do? Straighten yourself out, go to, yeah, right, a real blank Mary Poppins we've got here. Looking into his cold blue eyes, Barbara had experienced the hollow feeling of being hated for the first time in her life. The hatred had been so strong it seemed to fill the already stuffy courtroom and made it harder for her to put him out of her mind. A short 11 months later, Wertko served his own time. 6 months in reform school ought to teach the little bastard something, Keith had said. Bet they don't waste their time coddling his ass in Dallas either. Barbara had borne the snide remark in silence, but Wertko's conviction for assault hit her like a personal defeat. Somehow she should have been able to reach him that first time, turn him away from his self-destructive path before it swallowed him whole. She'd beaten herself up about that for a long time, but it won't happen again. Barbara didn't realize she'd spoken aloud until the uniformed officer beside her at the coffee machine turned with a questioning expression. What? Oh, nothing. The officer spooned a generous portion of sugar into his coffee and moved on. Barbara filled 2 mugs and headed back to the office. Okay, Hopkins, no more mothering. Put your emotions in a bag, stay detached. Weaving her way down the crowded hallway, she wondered if the pep talk would work. Now, Wertko ends up being a suspect later in the one. This book has several murders, and he ends up being one of the suspects in the one of the murders. This is introducing a different side of Barbara. She's been in a relationship for a while, and it was kind of going nowhere, and she finally realized it's really going nowhere. Barbara sipped her margarita and idly watched the crowd of dancers trying to keep up with the wild music exploding from the sound system. The Rooster's Roost was Twin Lake's sole offer of entertainment for the younger set, and the place was always jammed. It had the same spangled facade of some of the Dallas night spots, but under the glitter, it remained a renovated hay barn. Most of the time she enjoyed it, though. Barbara loved to dance, losing herself in pounding bass or slow, soulful melodies that invited intimacy between partners. Tonight, she just wasn't in the mood. It'll do you good to be around normal people for a change, Roger said when she'd suggested a quiet dinner. He opted for the Roost. She'd only agreed because it hadn't been worth the hassle of arguing. Her whole life had become one big hassle of late. Problems at work or problems with Roger, take your pick. Her feelings about him were riding a seesaw that had been more down than up the last few months. The strain was palpable. Of course, she blamed herself, the pressure of her job, her changing values, maybe. To give him his due, Roger hadn't changed, and as she looked at his broad, handsome face, she wondered if that was the problem. Roger was exactly the same as when she'd met him 6 months ago at a benefit for Special Olympics at the country club. Then she'd been impressed with his confident air and explained away the first hints she had seen of his self-absorption. He hadn't become a successful developer by being benevolent or shy. Sometimes a person has to be a little obsessive, a little pushy to make it. So why couldn't she see him that way now instead of making mental lists of his personality flaws? She looked away before her face could give her away. Why am I crucifying myself? It would be stupid to pretend that she hadn't been affected by the wedding of her last single friend. That had been 2 years ago. And when Marcy called a few weeks ago to announce her pregnancy, it suddenly made the encroachment of 40 more frightening. Could Barbara meet someone, fall in love, get married, and have a baby in the next 5 years? She took another sip of her drink and glanced back at Roger, who was sitting with an unreadable expression. Suddenly, her eyes misted as she was struck with a stunning realization. It was over. Part of her wanted to be relieved. She wouldn't have to endure the post-date agony of self-doubt anymore. But it was hard to feel anything but sadness when she remembered that once, just a few months ago, she'd cared for him. Even now, the part of her that wanted motherhood wished that they'd been able to work things out. Where'd you go off to? Roger's tone, like his expression, was unreadable. Oh, she offered a tentative smile. Nowhere in particular. It's the job, isn't it? That's all you have time for anymore. Barbara sighed, a tiredness knotting her shoulder. Let's not start that again. This is our first date in weeks. Couldn't we just relax and have a good time? I've had plenty of evenings free. His petulance made her want to scream or laugh or both. When will you realize the truth, he continued. Lose that insane attachment to your job and we could have something here. A glitch in the sound system sent a scream of steel strings through the room, and Barbara grabbed the interruption like a lifeline. It gave her a moment to take a breath and find some tactful way to say she had a headache. Then another noise intruded and saved her again. She reached in her purse and grabbed her cell phone. She checked the number displayed and started to connect before realizing it was too noisy near the dance floor to hear anything. She looked over at Roger. "Excuse me." He shrugged and waved her away. A few minutes later, she rushed back to the table. "There's been another murder," she said quickly. "I've got to go." If the situation hadn't been so desperate, she would have laughed at his expression. It was almost triumphant, like he'd been waiting for an opportunity to prove she cared more about her job than him. He didn't have a clue. Grabbing her denim blazer from the back of the chair, she was glad she'd driven her own car. She gave him one last look. "Goodbye, Roger." He didn't respond. It probably didn't even register that it was really goodbye. 5 minutes? Okay, well, I will stop there. And does anybody have any questions? Yes, sir?
Are you still not comfortable using foul language?
This from my Marine son, who taught me more foul language. On occasion.
Not a word.
Not a word. Not a word.
And I may have missed it because I had to step out, but what gave you the idea for this book? What inspired you?
Well, there are several series of killings, and one of them, the killer uses a quilt to subdue the victim and then kill her. And when Margaret and I decided to write a book, neither one of us had written a book before, and we wanted a murder mystery. We were reading about cases in the Dallas area at that time that it was being dubbed the blanket rapist, and there was a man going around, but he wasn't killing his victims. But we just thought it'd be kind of cool. In the book, in the book, in the book, to kill the people, not for real. That's one nice thing about being a mystery writer. You can just kill people and you never have to go to jail. Did you have a question?
Actually, not a question, but a comment. I love your character. I love Barbara, and you describe her. I can see her.
Thank you.
And letting us know really who she is and what moves and motivates her. That was very good.
Thank you. Thank you.
Is Roger that bad of a guy?
Roger,
or is he just like kind of a dunce?
just kind of a dunce and so full of himself. He's rich, cowboy, but you know, and he's got lots of money and does all this stuff. And he's just one of those people. He wanted eye candy on his arm, and Barbara's not eye candy. I mean, she's cute, but that's not her role. Gotcha. So they just didn't mix. And one thing I want to say just real quick about the collaborative process, because it was really interesting. When I picked this book up after a number of years of never looking at it again, I could not tell where Margaret's writing left off and mine began. But her influence is definitely here. I mean, the way she describes some of the minor characters, there's a medical examiner in here who's got bushy white eyebrows and an Adam's apple, and he wears a bow tie, and when he talks his bow tie goes up. And Margaret did that, you know. And the first time we're introduced to one of the killers who's really, he's the psychotic guy. The rest of them are killers because for other reasons. And the first time she introduced him, I was like, oh my God, what a horrible man. But she just nailed that eerie, psychotic, ooh, you don't want to be around this man very often, you know? So it was really cool to know that somehow we blended it all so well that I really don't know where her writing, you know, it just was so cool. Oh, 1 minute. 1 minute. Well, I do have copies of this as well as my other mysteries on the table. I've got a police procedural series set in Dallas, 2 women homicide detectives who have to be partners even they don't want to be because they're thrown together by the PR department that decides to solve some racial tensions by having a white cop and a black cop work together. They don't want to because she's got issues, and so that's what the Seasons mystery series deals with. And I've got another mystery set in Arkansas when the mob ruled Hot Springs in the 50s and just through the early 60s, I think up through 65. So, and I thank you for listening. You were a great audience, and I appreciate it. Thank you.